This session we'll be talking about blockchain in business beyond the hype. This is an overview webinar, and as such, we're going to describe the program to you in a little bit more detail and allow you to ask questions related to the program. My name is Carmen Taglienti, and I'll be your course leader for this class, and it's all a virtual class. A couple things logistically that I wanted to cover with you before we get going. The first thing is that there will be a chat window within Zoom. So if you're not familiar with it, you might want to look on the toolbar and find the chat window. And there's also a question and answer window that you can use to ask questions as we go through the session. So I encourage you to ask questions as we go. I will be monitoring them and we'll be answering your questions now and throughout the entire session. So we're honored to have with us Omid Malikan, who's the explainer-in-chief and author of Blockchain Book, and he will be our faculty guide throughout this course. And of course, as I mentioned, I will be your course leader, and I will be with you during the entire program, which will help to, I'll help to guide you through the course as we work through the different sessions and answer questions, and I'll be holding office hours as well. So to start, what I'd like to do is ask you a question. And so actually two questions, and you can put your answers into the chat window. And then as we go, I can look through them. But first of all, what brings you here today? What is your interest in this particular program? And then what country are you from? Because we tend to get a very eclectic group of people for this class. And so it's nice to know where people are from. And as I mentioned before, you can put your responses into the chat box window, and I will collect those, and then we'll talk a little bit about it toward the end of the class. And as you do that, just make sure that you you're responding to all panelists and attendees within the Zoom window. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the program. So I'm sure you're all well aware of the virtues of taking a class from Columbia Business School. So obviously very prestigious university. The business school is offering this program, and it's one that's very important. And Omid and I will go through some of the characteristics of the program, and I'm sure you'll find it very interesting, especially it's super relevant to what's happening in banking today and in the economy. And so we'll cover a lot of the different topic areas that would be important to you as you learn about blockchain and the importance of blockchain in today's industry. So who's the program for? So the program is for a group of different types of people. So you don't necessarily have to be a computer scientist. You don't have to have a technical background. And so what we're focusing on here are professionals, C-suite executives, people who will be impacted or need to know about the blockchain and the importance of the blockchain. Entrepreneurs, people that are looking to be innovators, that are looking to start new companies, areas where the blockchain will be part of the infrastructure that they will be using as you think about the modern banking and financial systems. Corporate attorneys, risk officers to understand some of the logistics and even the regulatory frameworks and domains that may be associated with using the blockchain and the different implementations of the blockchain. And then finally, marketing and research folks that are interested in understanding the popularity, but also how to leverage these capabilities as it starts to become more commonplace to be able to use digital currencies, in addition to using the blockchain for things like supply chain monitoring and management. Okay, so who are some of our speakers? So if we look at the speakers that we have for this particular class, so we have Gur Huberman, who's a faculty director at Columbia Business School and in our executive education program. So you'll be hearing from him. We'll be hearing from Kathy Barrera, who's a partner and founding economist at Prism Group. Stuart Haber, who is president of Stuart Haber Crypto LLC. And interestingly, as we get into the program in a little bit more detail, him and Scott Stornetta, who you'll see in a second, are one of the founding fathers, if you will, of the blockchain. And they produced a paper, was probably 15 or 20 years ago now, that had to do with digital timestamps. And it was really the seminal work related to the blockchain. So before blockchain became popular, Bitcoin became popular, he and Scott Stornetta produced a paper while they were at Belcore, which was now AT&T, about just digital timestamping, which allowed for the creation of the blockchain, which is what we know today. So additionally, we'll hear from Sharon Ladley, who's a blockchain ecosystem leader at IBM. Omid, as we'll talk about in a minute, and he can introduce himself in a little bit more detail, and he will explain the program to you overall. And as I mentioned, Scott Stornetta, who's the chief scientist at Yugen Partners, who will explain some of the foundational elements of the blockchain and how it all started. So those will be interesting. Those will be interesting discussions that you'll hear from some of our faculty speakers. So with that, I will pass it off to Omid, and he can talk through the program.
Thank you, Carmen. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. So the overview of the program is that this is a dissection of a fairly technical concept, but geared for a business audience. So as if any of you have tried to learn about blockchain, you've probably come across a lot of technical stumbling blocks, as I myself did years ago when I first dove into this world as somebody who had primarily a Wall Street background. And since then, I've had to become something of an expert on some of the technical aspects, but I deal primarily in a business setting. Just to finish off my bio, I am the author of a book on blockchain technology. I am an adjunct professor at Columbia Business School. And I also work as a blockchain consultant, primarily in financial services for places like Citi Ventures, the VC arm of Citibank. So I exist at the intersection of how this technology impacts the business world, and that's how this course is actually designed. So once you go through it, you're going to be able to understand the key components of blockchain technology, and I'm going to separate blockchain as a technology, and then cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, that's an application of that technology. It's by far the most prominent application, but there are other applications which include things like smart contracts. There are specific business applications, and there's this distinction that you learn from the course between what we call a permissionless network and a permissioned one. And you'll also have some appreciation for how the latter is used in the business world in different industries. We're going to review the notion of blockchain governance, because the point of all of this is to achieve some degree of decentralization, but that means that you need to have a mechanism through which the different participants, whether they're the general public or just 5 companies, decide how to run the network. So we're going to cover that. And then last, but certainly not least, by the time you finish this course, not only are you going to have an understanding of some of the more popular business applications, but you'll also have the ability to think about your industry and your career as to how it might use this technology in the future. If we can go to the next slide. The course is broken down into 6 different modules. Module 1 is to establish the technical foundations. So as I said, you will be learning about some technological or cryptographic concepts. Mainly, we're going to be covering distributed systems or distributed consensus and how they work. This notion of hash functions and how they form the foundation of blockchain as a technology. And then how cryptography is used, things like digital signatures, public-private keys, and the idea of pseudonymous identity. If all of these things sound intimidating to you, as they should in some ways, because they did for me, then you're actually in the right place, because the point of the module 1 is designed to bring a general business audience without any technical background to the point where they can at least understand how these technical concepts work and how they relate to the field of blockchain. in module 2, we're going to change gears and talk about money, because cryptocurrencies, the main application of blockchain, do dovetail with this notion of money. And they've created all these fascinating discussions about what is money, what counts as money, where does money come from, why does it exist? And we do touch on that, including a bit of interesting history. We talk about the Bitcoin blockchain. Since Bitcoin is the leading example of this technology, a lot of the course is based on it. So we talk about you will learn about how the Bitcoin ecosystem is designed as a payment system. I see a question that I'll address right now, that is cybersecurity a part of the class? It is, to the extent that it applies to blockchain and cryptocurrencies. Security is a big part of all of this. Like, one of the assignments that students will have is to go and review, for example, the original Bitcoin white paper written by the unknown author Satoshi Nakamoto. And when you do that, you'll see that the whole point of inventing blockchain was to answer the question, how do you secure a decentralized network where not one company or government is necessarily in charge? So those aspects of cybersecurity are covered. And what you learn about keys and hashing also have applications in areas of cybersecurity that are not related to blockchain. But returning to module 2, lastly, we will be looking at how Bitcoin's transaction processing system contrasts with existing transaction processing systems, like what banks and payment providers use today from a pre-blockchain technological point of view. Then in module 3, we're going to now talk about this intersection of blockchain as technology and then Bitcoin as an application. So here we delve into some of the more interesting aspects of the whole Bitcoin solution, things like how does mining work, or what is mining? How are fees determined? And what is this idea of the fixed inflation, where the creation of new Bitcoins is done algorithmically in a way that's very distinct from any other kind of money that's come before it. Then in module 4, which is taught by yours truly, we go to the next level of the technology, which is beyond what Bitcoin does, what other blockchain solutions like Ethereum provide, which are smart contracts and tokens. So we'll discuss what differs Ethereum from Bitcoin. We'll talk about how smart contracts and tokens work on Ethereum and how they enable something known as a DApp, a decentralized application. And then we'll dive into some of the more popular types of tokens that are being already actively used out there, like tokens that are currency tokens made for payments. They're asset-backed tokens, which represent real-world assets, and then they're utility tokens that give users access to different kinds of decentralized applications. Then in module 5, we cover first the governance challenges. This idea of the technology is one thing, but how people go about using it, whether it's governance of a network like Bitcoin or governance of a more permissioned enterprise blockchain. So here is where Kathy Barrera will walk users through how decisions are made, how power is structured, and how blockchain networks evolve. And then in the second half, we'll talk about enterprise solutions. And this is where Sharon Lade from IBM. IBM is one of the most active big companies in the blockchain world. So she will talk about specific examples for things like supply chain management or digital identity, how the blockchain solution is utilized and what it enables. Then to wrap it all up, in module 6, we talk about blockchain for the executive decision maker and how one can expect this technology to unfold as it increasingly becomes absorbed by the business world. So we'll talk about whether a business should use blockchain or not, and if they do, what are the different parameters for what a company to look at, what an industry should look at, what counts as success, which new markets might be created, and also how this technology also touches on some other related technologies like artificial intelligence. And
thank you, Omid. Sorry about that. I had to unmute. So if there are any questions, again, I just would urge you to enter them into the chat window, and then we can follow along and answer your questions. So from an assignment perspective, I just wanted to cover at a very high level what some of the assignments will focus on. So we'll look at seeing how hash functions work in practice, and we'll create our own outputs. So that'll be one of the early things that we do, is talk a little bit more detail, as Omid mentioned, about hash functions and what the importance of hash functions are. Then we'll go through the simulation and the creation of your own blockchain. So we'll talk about blockchain, we'll talk about the fundamentals of blockchain, but to be able to create your own is also an important characteristic. So it's one thing, as I mentioned earlier, to know what is a blockchain, but it's another thing to really experience it. And then finally, performing critical analysis of a cryptocurrency of your choice. That'll be our capstone, where you actually look into an implementation. And Omid had mentioned Bitcoin as one of the implementations. And there are many of them out there. I think well, right now, I think there's like 130 to 150 different implementations of a currency based on the blockchain. And so you can look into one that maybe is of interest to you and look at it in a little bit more detail. And then we'll talk about the pros and cons of each of the implementations. And then a little bit from a business perspective, what does it take to become a successful cryptocurrency? And those will be things that we'll look at as part of the capstone project. So next we'll talk a little bit about the program highlights. And from a program perspective, we have live faculty teaching sessions, of course. We have guest speakers, and especially the guest speakers are important because in a class like this, it's not just academic. You want to ensure that you are getting some practical real world experience to understand how is the application of things like blockchain, how does it impact the way that the industry is moving, and what are some of the things that are coming in the future. Cryptocurrency was a good question and a good example of how this is done, but also what are the impacts around things like security. So asking those questions is really an important part of this particular curriculum in class. The learning is bite-sized learning. So there are videos, there are segments and modules that you will work through. And so you can work through them at your own pace. And then it also gives you the ability through things like office hours and our weekly sessions to be able to ask questions, to be able to make sure that you're learning at a pace that is comfortable for you. We have dedicated program team support so that through Canvas, through our program support team, can answer any questions that you might have, whether they're technical in nature, or Omid and I are available to answer your questions that might be more related to either the course in particular or how the application within the industry is performed and what are some of the characteristics of that. I already mentioned the real world application. Our guest speakers will talk about that, but we as your guides throughout this course can also provide a level of detail on the application within the real world and help to answer those questions. Simulations and case studies, plenty of reading that you'll be able to do, and also some simulations that you'll be able to work with, which will explain some of the major concepts around things like the hash functions or the blockchain itself. And we will go through some of the webinars. We can go through and you can work along with me as we talk about things like Bitcoin, how to use digital wallets. We'll go through, but also ETHEREUM, how our smart contracts done and created. We'll go through exercises like that so you get some more practical experience. From a peer learning and feedback perspective, encourage you all to use the discussion boards. The discussion boards are ways to share ideas with your classmates just so that you understand what is happening in industry, who has different perspectives on a particular topic area, or just general understanding, asking questions of the group to be able to ensure that the program is smooth and you learn the most out of the different subject areas that we'll be covering. There's also Canvas. You can use it on the mobile app if you don't want to use it on the computer or on your train ride to work or whatever. Hopefully we are at least out of the social distancing issue at that point, so that you can actually watch your, you could watch your programs directly, like on the train or wherever you might be. And then grading and evaluation, the majority of the grading is actually done in an automated fashion, which is kind of cool, so that you can get immediate response to the grading as it occurs. Things like the capstone program, the project, I will give you feedback directly on that, so that'll be a little bit more interactive. And then also we'll, as we get into things like office hours that I'll be hosting, you can ask questions directly there and I can give you feedback as we go. So that's from a program highlights perspective. And then at the end of it, upon successful completion, you'll get a Columbia Business School Executive Education Certificate. And as you're aware, it's, you know, holds a lot of value within the industry coming from Columbia Business School. And as we have been talking about, the topic area is really important and very relevant to today's industry, both financial and banking industry. But also even more broadly across things like the supply chain. So as you think about sort of supply chain tracking becomes really important. And you'll see a couple of those examples as we go through the class. Okay, and then finally, just the registration for the class is at this location. You can, I actually need to see if I can copy that into the window. Sorry about that. But basically the class will be starting on the 22nd of April. So you can go ahead and enroll. And the deadline would be on the 21st. And then I will paste this into the window once we're completed. Oops, sorry, it's already been pasted into the window. So you can click on that if you want to register. So now what I want like to do is to open it up for any questions that you might have. And Owen and I are here to answer the questions you might have. I can look through the chat window to see if there are any questions, and I do see a few. So yeah, go ahead, Owen.
Yeah, so I'll start off, and please everybody, one thing you should know during this webinar, and also if you sign up for the course, whether you're interacting with me or Carmen, there is no such thing as a dumb question when it comes to this subject. It's a very different way of thinking about the world. And a lot of times, whatever question that you may have, probably everybody else has too. So please, starting right now, keep them coming. I'll start by addressing John's question, which is, will blockchain be focused on B2B or include B2C? As far as the course is concerned, the two main areas of focus are what I guess it's C2C, or the peer-to-peer world, which is what we call public permissionless blockchains. Permissionless as in you don't need anyone's permission to use them, like Bitcoin and Ethereum. Those are open for anybody to use to interact with anybody. So probably the most common usage is one person interacting with another, like if I were to send Carmen some Bitcoins. And then the class then on the enterprise side, most of the action so far has been on the B2B space. So that's where the course focuses, because we try to mirror what the industry is doing. And the reason for that is manyfold, but perhaps the biggest one is that the decentralized nature of this technology poses a lot of interesting regulatory questions. And those questions are easier to answer in a B2B setting than a B2C one. Next question. We have from anonymous attendee asking about the limitations of Ethereum. There's a whole module on Ethereum, module 4, the one that I cover, which also touches on things like the limitations, which primarily are actually in the throughput domain, as in how much can it do, how many transactions can it process, how much smart contract code can it process in any given second. those will be touched upon, and also the module also covers a bit of the history of Ethereum and the different challenges and crises that it's had to overcome.
So here, I see a question from Roshan, who asks, is this the first time you've covered this, you offered this program? So this is the third time that this is being offered or run, this particular course. Actually, by the time this one starts, it'll be the fourth. So we have had a decent amount of feedback and experience. So we have enhanced the program to be a little bit more applicable to sort of, I'll call it the current state of the art in terms of the way blockchain and the different cryptocurrencies are being used today. There was another question from Ellen, and it said, is there more classes for supply chain management with respect to Bitcoin and artificial intelligence to follow this course? And Omid, I might pass that off to you. I don't know if there are any other courses offered through CBS that could that focus on this area or not, or those areas.
I don't think so. I think as far as blockchain is concerned, this is currently from Columbia Business School, the only online course that's open to the public.
Got it.
We have this this other, Carmen, do you want to quickly delve, because this touches on what you do professionally too, about how can blockchain be used in the cybersecurity industry? This is from Anonymous.
Got it. Yeah. So so what we do in so I work at financial institution, but now I'm actually currently working at a digital innovation company, and what we focus on are solutions for customers that are using these technologies to be able to not just manage sort of financial assets, but from a cybersecurity perspective, we focus on things like, especially related to data governance, but regulatory framework, things like non-repudiation, in terms of when you make a transaction, did you actually make the transaction? And is it legitimately you as the individual performing a particular transaction? So that's an important part of that as well. So that's basically the ensuring the integrity of the blockchain transactions. And then in the case of where we see this the most related to things like cybersecurity is, and Omid mentioned this earlier, is how are you effectively creating the enforcement of things like anonymization or encryption of the data that's stored within the blockchain itself. So that's an important part of it as well. So then this gets into how do you create the public-private keys? How do you manage those keys, store those keys, and then make sure that you provide the access so that only the appropriate consumer is able to access that information. So you can see all of this sort of moving its way into the blockchain as well, especially in the case where if you go with sort of the call it the generic implementation of the peer-to-peer network. Normally this was, you should be able to see the actual, the blocks on the blockchain, and you'll see this when we get into Bitcoin a little bit more and even Ethereum. But the contents necessarily can be encrypted so that only people who are supposed to have access do have access. I think that's where it really comes into play when you think about this. And we'll talk about the different varieties of blockchain implementations, but some of it does have to do with protection of information and integrity of information.
And I'll just add that blockchain has forced an acceleration of the development of a lot of different security technologies, including cybersecurity, for the simple reason that, as you'll see in the course, one of the things that makes something like a Bitcoin very interesting is it's something that's never existed before, which is a digital bearer asset, meaning that it's digital, it only exists on the internet, but it's a bearer asset in the sense that whoever owns it is the legal possessor. Previous to Bitcoin, the only way you could own a digital asset was through a company or a government. You could have a bank account, but then the bank controlled it. So with digital bearer assets, you have this possibility of digital theft, which didn't exist before. And you've probably heard about all of these spectacular hackings of things like Bitcoin. That's a bit of a misnomer. What's happened in the situations where you hear, oh, somebody stole $1 million worth of Bitcoin, it wasn't a hacking of the Bitcoin blockchain. The blockchain actually worked as intended. It was a hacking of a user who was not careful with how they go about securing their assets. So when we cover the technical parts of this, like public-private keys and whatnot, there's a lot of application to that, to the world of cybersecurity in general. And there's an increasing convergence, as Carmen was saying, between what qualifies as just cybersecurity and what's the domain of blockchain.
Right. So, yeah, and so there's a question from Anonymous here about application of blockchain in the banking section. And I don't think it's in the specifically in the banking section, but the simulation that we'll be using for creation of blockchain is made available by Scott Stornetta's company. I think it's underwritten by Yugen Partners, if I'm not mistaken. But that's where you can actually create your own blockchain and then go through the whole process of quote unquote mining, or basically looking where you go through the addition of blocks directly to the blockchain and the consensus driven approach. So that's where you can actually create your own blockchain on a particular topic and then see how the process actually works. So that is a pretty interesting simulation that you can go through. The actual creation of blockchain, and so I've done some of this actually with the distributed ledger technology at a company that I worked at. And it's a non-trivial process, although creating your own blockchain, it can be rewarding. It's relatively complicated, as you will learn. But what you're starting to see is that even cloud platforms like Amazon, Google, Microsoft are starting to provide blockchain services. So that's kind of an interesting characteristic too of not only the popularity of blockchain, but also sort of the implementation structure that's becoming common enough that you can see these offerings from particular cloud vendors.
And I'll add that as one who works in banking, the banking sector, the application of blockchain is pretty much everything, for the simple reason that, to oversimplify, what banks do is they move value from here to here. So that could be a payment, that could be a security, a stock that you own that you buy and sell. That could be something more complicated, like they take a bunch of mortgages and bundle them and sell them. And blockchain is a technology invented to upgrade how value is moved from here to here, to take into account a world where everybody is connected. So within the banking sector already, there are a bunch of efforts on the way to use the technology for currency in the world of payments, to use the technology for financial market infrastructure for things like securities trading. And then also even internally, a lot of the big banks have projects going on where they're using the technology only within their own business network, just to make it easier for them to move value back and forth within their balance sheet.
And then Roshan asked, who's the target audience? And we had a slide on this a little bit earlier, but the target audience is really focused mostly on folks with a business perspective. So this is not a technical course, so it's not about what are the best hashing algorithms that we could possibly use, although we will cover a little bit of the technology, but it's really directed toward C-level execs or business leaders within organizations. We talked about marketing folks, entrepreneurs, innovators. So that's really the focus area. Mostly what we're trying to impart to folks through this program are what are the characteristics of the technology and how can they be used in order to be able to solve business problems within within industry or different vertical industries. Okay, and those are great questions, by the way, so thank you all for asking them. I think we've covered all of the questions.
We
Does
have,
anybody have any? Yeah, go
we
ahead.
have, there is one if you scroll down.
Oh, sorry, I missed it.
Yeah, there's the
You're right.
question of the capstone project and how feedback is relayed.
Yeah, so the capstone project is just at a really, really high level. You'll see some of the specifics when you register for the class. But what this is about is, as we will learn about the different characteristics of the blockchain, and then what the capstone really focuses on is selecting your own cryptocurrency and then looking at the details of the implementation of the cryptocurrency. So what are some of the design decisions that went into the selection of that particular cryptocurrency? What are its pros and cons? And then what are some of the things that you would look at in terms of, will this be a successful cryptocurrency? Because a lot of cryptocurrency has started and then failed because there just wasn't enough interest, or they didn't gain enough momentum to be successful, because adoption is really a big part of ensuring the success of a particular cryptocurrency. Bitcoin, clearly one of the first, actually the first, and most popular, has been able to survive for a long time, but it also has its own limitations, which we'll also talk about. But you'll pick another one and then go into some of the analysis. The feedback really comes through. There are weekly pieces of the capstone that you would do over time. So you basically do an incremental contribution to your capstone week by week. And then as you do that, I will provide feedback to you, which would say things like, if the selection of the say pros and cons was one of the things that we were looking at for, say, I don't know, making it up week 5, then you would, I would give you feedback on those characteristics that you would have identified, and then answer any questions that you might have related to that, just to make sure that from an incremental perspective, we stay on track in terms of getting to the final objective, which is the capstone project at the end.
And the question of, can I focus the capstone on stellar lumens? Yeah, I believe that is on the list.
Yep. So someone joined late. Yes, this is available. This is being recorded. And I don't, I guess program support can answer the question as to, I believe that anybody that has registered will get the link to the class, so that you could take a look at this, or not, it's not a class, but to this webinar, so that you can review it at your leisure. And are there more classes in supply chain management with respect to Bitcoin and artificial intelligence to follow this course? Currently there are not. I have seen courses in other areas that do talk to this, but not in this particular program.
And I also want to address, someone asked, how can the course assist those with an audit and accounting background? The main point of the course is to actually give everyone a good fundamental understanding in a way that they can then go on to apply to whatever their own industry and domain is. And audit and accounting is actually very interesting. If you look at all of the biggest audit firms in the world, they all have these massive blockchain departments now, and they're very active in this world, which makes sense because once you learn how a blockchain is actually constructed, this idea of a distributed digital ledger that uses cryptography, then the first thing you'll realize is that it solves a lot of the problems that need audit today. In that once you move to this technology, you have an audit trail of every transaction that's ever happened in a way that you can program and analyze, and anybody can. So if the world of audit and accounting doesn't evolve, this technology could be competition for them, actually, because people who use it won't need as much audit and accounting. But if the industry does evolve, which I believe it will, I think it's actually going to be very aligned with the blockchain world, because it will be up to auditors and accountants to weigh in on how different blockchains, and as we're getting more and more industry specific networks, how they're designed, how they're run, how they're coded, And I've personally encouraged friends of mine who are auditors and accountants to start paying attention to this technology, because I do think it's going to change the nature of their work in the coming years.
Great. So I don't see any additional questions. Anyone have any more questions that they might have? Or feel free to reach out to us directly. I think that there was an email. Yep. So you can forward any questions to columbia@emeritus.org. And then we'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have after the fact. You might think of a question after the session ends, or if you re-review this, but we'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. Okay, so if there aren't any additional questions, I think we can wrap up the session, and want to thank you for your attendance and your attention for the session, and look forward to guiding you through this program in the future.
Yeah, thank you, everybody, and hope to see you soon.